Hello everyone, Mr. Larson here. In this video, we're going to be talking about population evolution and how populations can actually change within a species and how species actually can become different species. So this right here is a genetic bell curve when we're talking about traits, when we're talking about physical characteristics of species. So here you can see this is a very basic bell curve. This is what you generally see with a lot of these traits, where a larger population has more of the average of that trait. So here we can see the phenotype is height, and over here on our left, we can see that these are the frequencies. So this basically just means that the more individuals within a species have that average height, where less is over here and less is over in the extreme areas. So we're going to see this is a basic general bell curve, but we can see how this might change within a population. And we'll talk about the different ways that this happens. So when we're talking about polygenic traits, we're always talking about the frequency of certain genes. So we always want to think of these as, when we're talking about populations, we want to look at the percentages of these different traits. So here you can see an example of a gene pool. So within a species of rats, we have about 40% of them, 48% of them being heterozygous black, meaning they have one black allele and one brown fur allele. So they are the mixed. Here we have a homozygous, meaning that both traits are brown, and 16, and we have a homozygous black. So reflecting back on our genetics, when we're talking about alleles, that dominant versus recessive, here we're looking at um, a heterozygous black, homozygous black, and homozygous brown. So just reflecting back on those dominant and recessive traits and how they interact with each other. So when we're talking about traits, one thing that allows these to change is what is called genetic drift. So this is just a random change in allele frequency, meaning that a certain physical trait changes just completely randomly. So here we have a population of bugs that exist in a certain area. So let's say these 4 bugs here decide to move to a completely new area. So they are now what is called a founding population. So the founding population is these 4 right here. Because these 4 are the founding population, any species or any individuals that are born in this area will have very similar traits to these 4. So this is a kind of a simpler idea just because, of course, when you move to a new population or move to a new area, whoever founded that population will generally be what is there. So this is also another example here where we have these 4 individuals. They move to a new population or move to a new area. So this is our founding population. And then, of course, the individuals born after will look like those 4 that originally founded that population. So we can see this with human nature as well. So in small populations, an allele may become more popular and more common within a population. So just based upon who founded that area, they will more than likely have those physical characteristics. So the results of this entire idea of genetic drift is that the new descendant populations are different than each other and the original population. So this is as you can see here over on left, they are a mixed group. But since they have been moved, they go to a different area, the descendants will now look completely different than what is over here on our left. They will not be as mixed. They'll have more characteristics based upon that founding population. So one possibility or one type of selection that occurs with natural selection just based upon these changes is what is called directional selection, where due to this change in areas, so the population has now moved, one extreme might become more successful and becomes more common than the other. So beak size, so let's say beak size is just a normal bell curve here. This bird population now moves to a different area. So let's say they move to a new island. And now the larger beak size is now favored. So natural selection, those with smaller beaks die off. Those with larger beaks are now able to survive and reproduce. So directional selection is where one extreme is now more successful and becomes more common. A different type of selection is what is called stabilizing selection, where both extremes are now unsuccessful or don't allow the species to survive and reproduce as well, and then become less common. So these birds have now moved to a new island where those that are in the middle with birth weight here, so this is kind of an idea with birth weight. But this becomes more common, and now we have a more stable in the middle here. So this is the example we use for this is when we're talking about birth, so actual human birth. So those that are more found in the middle here, that have a more average weight, are more likely to survive. So those that have a lower birth weight are less likely to survive, and ones that are a higher birth weight are less likely to survive. So this selection prevents against both extremes and kind of narrows the curve. So it makes this more common in the middle here. Disruptive selection. So this is another possible thing that happens. So both extremes are now successful and the middle is no longer successful. So this is what happens where we get this sort of double kind of camelback here, where you get those two humps. Now the population is being split into two different groups based upon the seeds becoming more common. So this is a example where larger and smaller seeds are now more common within an area. So then the bird species will now react to this, where those that have the smaller beaks and the larger beaks now become more successful in reproducing and surviving. So these are our three types of selection that occur within this idea of genetic drift. So when we're always talking about phenotypes when it comes to physical characteristics. So phenotypes are those physical characteristics. So this is a picture of a bunch of different dogs. This right here is my dog Ruka. So the bonus question asks, what is my dog's name? It is Ruka. You can spell that R-U-C-A. So this is Ruka right here. And why does natural selection act directly on the phenotype instead of the genotype? So when we're talking about phenotypes, we always want to think of survival and reproduction. So these physical characteristics allow the species to survive better. And then, of course, it gets passed on to the next generation. So another process of sort of genetic drift, or how species can change, is what is called speciation. So this is when two populations of the same species become separated and then begin to adapt to their individual environments. So then they become completely different species. So let's say, for an example, a river now just goes through a new island, separating a certain species. They might eventually become completely different species due to this different adaptations. So what can cause speciation? There are possible ways that this happens. One is called geographic isolation, where a species now becomes separated by either mountains, oceans, rivers, lakes, any sort of geographical situation forces these species to come into different areas. So these are all barriers between gene pools. So gene pools is just what's being passed on to the next generation. There we go. Let's do here. Reproductive isolation. So basically not allowing these species to reproduce together. So one is a behavioral isolation. So now a species might have different mating rituals. So now that they have different mating rituals, these two species will not be reproducing together. So then they become completely different species. There's also temporal, meaning they are now separated by time, whether they are nocturnal or only come out at night, or they might be diurnal, where they only come out during the day, or different species have different breeding times, such as winter or summer. So each of these kind of creates, each of these different types of speciation creates a new species. So these are all adaptations that happen within a species. There's also such thing as chromosomal differences, where some species have more chromosomes than another, or more have less than another. So when they actually mate, the animal that is created from that mating becomes infertile because they don't have the same amount of chromosomes. So an example here is a mule. So you may have heard of a mule at some point in your life. A mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. So here you can see a horse has 32 chromosomes and a donkey has 31. So when you breed them together and create a mule, there is this sort of weird number of chromosomes. Since there is a weird number of chromosomes, this mule can no longer reproduce. So this is the only way we can create mules, is by crossing a horse and a donkey. So this is what is known as hybrid infertility, where this hybrid animal here can no longer reproduce. Another example is a liger. So you may have thought that this is actually not a real animal, but it's actually been created. So it is a male lion and a female tiger. Lions and tigers have different amounts of chromosomes, meaning that their hybrid here, or liger, cannot reproduce. So this is the only way we can get a liger is if we cross a male lion and a female tiger. So this cannot create or continue the species. So the final page here is a question for you. So answer this at the bottom of the digital lesson. So one species of tortoise lives in a specific region of a grassland. The climate has recently changed and flooding has caused a huge river to divide the region. So what do you expect to happen to the tortoise population over the next million years? And what is this process called? And what is the cause of this? So use this information from the presentation in order to answer this question and answer it on the digital lesson. Well, I hope this was interesting, and let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you guys soon.